The snow crunched under my boots as I hopped off the snowmobile. The engine idled, a low rumble in the frozen silence. The driver, a weathered guy named Hank, nodded towards the fire tower looming in the distance. "You'll be all right," he muttered, his voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around his face. "Just remember the rules. Ronnie's always on the radio if you need anything." I nodded back, even though my chest was tight with a nervous feeling I couldn't quite shake. This wasn't just a job for me. It was an escape. The cold, desolate Alaskan wilderness was the perfect place to disappear for a while, to put some serious distance between me and the life I'd left behind. The kind of distance that felt safe, necessary. The fire tower stood alone in the clearing, an 80-foot sentinel against the sea of pine trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. It looked older than I expected, its wooden frame weathered and creaking in the stiff wind. A set of rickety stairs spiraled to the top, where a small cabin perched like a bird's nest. I swallowed hard, adjusted my backpack, and started trudging towards it. Hank called after me, his voice sharp despite the wind. "One last thing. Don't mess with that floodlight unless you absolutely have to." I frowned, turning back. "Why not?" He shrugged like it wasn't even worth explaining. "You'll know if you need it." Then he revved the engine and sped off, leaving a plume of snow in his wake. I was alone. Inside the tower, the air was stale and faintly metallic, a smell that clung to the walls like the ghost of a long, forgotten fire. The cabin was small but functional, a bunk with a thin mattress, a wood stove, a desk cluttered with outdated maps, and a single radio sitting on top of a stack of manuals. The radio crackled to life just as I dropped my gear. "Is this the new guy?" The voice was rough but warm, like gravel wrapped in a blanket. I pressed the button on the side of the handset. "Yeah, just got here. You must be Ronnie, ah." "That's right. Welcome to paradise," he said with a dry chuckle. "First things first, settle in, but read that manual. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Anything specific I should know?" There was a pause, static hissing faintly in the background. "A few things. Don't leave the tower after dark, no matter what you hear. Don't shine that floodlight unless it's a real emergency. And if the radio goes dead, stay put until morning." His tone made it clear he wasn't kidding around. "Got it." I nodded to myself. The line went quiet, and I placed the handset back on its cradle. My eyes wandered to the desk where a thick, dog-eared manual sat beneath a stack of papers. On top of the pile was a leather-bound journal. Curious, I flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was scrawled and uneven, as if the writer had been in a rush or under duress. March 3rd, first day at the tower. Quiet so far, too quiet. The forest stretches on forever, a sea of black pines against the snow. It feels alive, somehow, like it's watching me. I'm probably just tired or imagining things. The entry ended abruptly, and I flipped forward, skimming through pages filled with fragmented thoughts. As I read, a pattern emerged. The writer, a guy named Caleb, had worked in the tower years ago. His early entries were mundane observations about the weather and the monotony of the job. But as I reached the later pages, his tone changed. March 12th. The wind doesn't sound right. It's not just wind. It's voices. I tried the floodlight, but it didn't help, just made things worse. I snapped the journal shut, a shiver crawling up my spine. My gaze drifted to the window, where the snow swirled in the fading light. The forest was dark now, its shadows stretching like fingers toward the base of the tower. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had crept in. It was just a story, a guy stuck in isolation, letting his mind get the better of him. Right? That night, the wind howled around the tower, shaking the walls and groaning through the beams. I lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, the journal's words circling in my mind. Somewhere outside, a faint knocking sound broke through the noise. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random creaks of the structure settling in the cold. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and approached the window, my heart hammering. The forest was still, blanketed in snow, but the sound continued. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the supports beneath the tower. Just the wind. I whispered to myself, though the words rang hollow. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, straining to hear anything else, but the only sound was the faint hiss of the wind. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I forced myself to shake off the uneasy feeling and focus on the job. Through the binoculars, I scanned the horizon, looking for smoke or any signs of trouble. The landscape was pristine, a frozen expanse of white and green that seemed endless. By noon, the radio crackled again. "How's it going up there?" Ronnie's voice broke the silence. "Quiet," I replied. "No smoke, no issues." "That's good. Keep your eyes open. This time of year things can change fast." Before I could respond, the radio emitted a strange burst of static, followed by a faint voice, too faint to make out the words. I adjusted the dial, but the line went dead. "Ronnie," I said into the handset. No response. Just static. I set it down, frowning. Maybe the storm the night before had messed with the signal. Or maybe it was just old equipment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the journal on the desk, its leather cover almost daring me to open it again, but I resisted. Instead, I picked up the binoculars and resumed my watch. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was distant, little more than a shadow among the trees, but it was unmistakably human. My pulse quickened as I adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer view. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I lowered the binoculars, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions. Who was that? What was that? And why had they been standing there, so close to the tower? I didn't have answers, but as the daylight faded and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, the knocking returned. Louder this time and more insistent. Knock. Knock, knock. It came from the same spot beneath the tower, but now it was joined by something else, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white, and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty forest below, but the sounds didn't stop. Knock, knock. Scrape. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. The radio was dead again, and Hank's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't mess with that floodlight unless you absolutely have to." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the switch. Was this an emergency? Did I need it? The knocking grew louder, more frantic. With a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The floodlight roared to life, bathing the clearing in a harsh, white glow. For a moment, the forest seemed to recoil, its shadows retreating like living things. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the light was the figure from before. It was closer now, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. It didn't move, it just stared. The floodlight flickered, and my blood ran cold. When it steadied, the figure was gone. I turned off the light and locked the door, my hands trembling. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait for dawn and hope I'd make it through the night. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I sat slumped in the chair by the desk, exhausted but alive. The journal stared back at me, its leather cover gleaming faintly in the pale light. I opened it again, flipping to a page I hadn't read before. The words seemed to leap off the page, scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. If you see it, don't look away. If it knocks, don't answer. It wants you to break the rules. I closed the journal with a snap, my heart pounding. Whatever I'd signed up for, it was far more than just a job, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The snow around the fire tower sparkled under the weak morning sun, a deceptively calm scene that felt worlds away from the night's events. My body ached from the tension of staying awake, and my mind raced, filled with unanswered questions. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen, the way it stood at the edge of the light, unmoving yet undeniably aware of me. I busied myself with routine tasks to push the memory aside. I scanned the forest with the binoculars, panning slowly across the endless sea of pines. Nothing unusual, no smoke, no movement, but the eerie stillness felt like a warning. The radio crackled suddenly, and I jumped. "Morning," Ronnie's voice greeted me, calm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "Everything's quiet. No smoke." "That's good," Ronnie said. Then he hesitated. "How was last night?" I paused, debating whether to tell him about the knocking, the scraping, the figure, but I remembered his earlier instructions: follow the rules, and you'll be fine. It felt like asking too many questions might break some unwritten rule. "It was fine," I lied. Ronnie didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped. "Good. Keep your head on straight out there. This job has a way of messing with people." The line went dead before I could reply. By mid-afternoon, a faint column of smoke appeared on the horizon, a dark thread against the pale blue sky. My heart sank. It wasn't supposed to happen this early in the season. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "Ronnie, do you copy? There's smoke southeast of my position. Maybe 5 miles out." Static hiss, followed by a faint, fragmented sound that didn't resemble Ronnie's voice. I adjusted the dial, but the line stayed dead. "Ronnie, are you there?" Nothing. I stared at the smoke, unsure of what to do. The manual was clear about staying close to the tower, but this situation didn't feel like something I could just ignore. If there was a fire, it could spread quickly, and I couldn't count on Ronnie to help. Grabbing my backpack, I stuffed it with essentials: water, a flashlight, a flare gun. I slipped the journal into a side pocket, almost as an afterthought. The thick leather made me feel slightly more grounded, as absurd as that seemed. Finally, I grabbed the rifle mounted on the wall. It was old and heavy, but the ammunition was intact. I didn't know what I was expecting to encounter, but after last night, I wasn't taking any chances. I descended the tower, the stairs creaking under my boots, and set off toward the smoke. The forest was silent as I moved through it, the snow crunching softly beneath my feet. The air was sharp and cold, biting at my face and filling my lungs with every breath. As I walked, the smoke grew closer, thicker, until the acrid smell of burning wood reached my nose. I found the source about an hour later, a campsite, or rather, what was left of one. The fire had been small and contained, but it had burned down to ashes. Around it, there were signs of a hasty departure: an overturned kettle, a torn sleeping bag, a scattering of belongings half buried in the snow. I crouched down, inspecting the scene. Something felt off. There were no footprints leading away from the site, no signs of anyone leaving, just the eerie suggestion that whoever had been here had vanished into thin air. Among the scattered items, something caught my eye, a blood-stained map. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as though it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. An X was scrawled on it in red ink, marking a spot deeper in the forest. My fingers hesitated before picking it up. The sight of the blood made my stomach churn, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I folded the map carefully and slid it into my pocket. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying a faint, hollow sound that I couldn't quite place. A chill ran down my spine. I stood scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless pines swaying gently in the breeze. I decided to head back to the tower. Whatever I'd stumbled upon, it wasn't something I wanted to deal with out here. The feeling of being watched clung to me all the way back. Night fell quickly, as it always did in the wilderness, and I returned to the relative safety of the tower. I locked the hatch behind me and double-checked the floodlight switches, making sure everything was in order. The rifle was propped against the wall beside the desk, within easy reach. As I sat down, the journal called to me, its leather cover glinting faintly in the lamplight. I flipped to a random page, my heart heavy with apprehension. March 15th. I saw it again, just standing there watching. I think wants me to leave. But it doesn't seem angry. Not yet. If I break the rules, though. I don't think it will let me go. The words sent a shiver through me. Was Caleb writing about the same figure I'd seen? The same one that had been just beyond the floodlight's reach? A loud knock jolted me from my thoughts. Knock. Knock. It was louder than before, echoing through the structure with a deliberate rhythm. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the flashlight. This time, the sound wasn't coming from beneath the tower. It was coming from the stairs. I stood, every muscle in my body tensed, and moved toward the window. The flashlight's beam swept over the steps, illuminating nothing but the empty wood. The knocking stopped abruptly. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low scraping sound, like nails dragging along the outer wall of the cabin. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned toward the floodlight switch, but a sudden surge of static from the radio made me freeze. The noise was sharp, grating, and it quickly gave way to something worse, a voice. It wasn't Ronnie's voice. It was distorted, guttural, and wrong. You're not alone. The words were faint but unmistakable. My hand hovered over the radio, unsure whether to respond. The static returned, louder now, until the speaker emitted a sharp crack and went silent. I stared at the radio, my mind racing. The knock, the scrape, the voice. It was all connected somehow, but I didn't know how to make sense of it. A sudden thud against the wall snapped me out of my thoughts. This wasn't random. It was testing me, trying to make me break the rules. I had to hold firm. I turned off the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting pale beams through the windows. I sat in the corner, clutching the rifle, and waited. The knocking didn't come again that night, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. The next morning, I unfolded the blood-stained map on the desk. The X stared back at me, as if daring me to find it. I didn't know why Caleb's journal hadn't mentioned a map or a campsite, but the connection felt undeniable. I grabbed the journal again, flipping through the pages in search of answers. One line stood out, written in shaky handwriting near the end. March 18th. It's drawing me closer. I think it wants me to find something. Or maybe it's leading me to my end. My hand trembled as I set the journal down. The X loomed large in my mind, a mystery I couldn't ignore. But the rules were clear: stay in the tower after dark. And yet, part of me wondered if that was exactly what Kit wanted. The journal's leather cover felt heavier in my hands as I opened it again. the faint smell of aged paper mingling with the cold air in the cabin. My eyes scanned the jagged handwriting of Caleb, the previous fire watcher. It was the only thing tethering me to some semblance of understanding, or at least, I hoped it would be. March 20th. I know it's watching me. Every time I turn away, I can feel it there, waiting. It doesn't just want me gone. It wants me to see something. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to look. The words sank in, gnawing at my thoughts. Caleb had walked these same steps, climbed these stairs, and stared out into the same forest. And yet, he hadn't made it out. What was it that he couldn't face? I flipped ahead, the pages filled with hurried, fragmented entries, each one more erratic than the last. March 27th. It's not the forest that's alive, it's the space between the trees. It moves when I blink, when I sleep, when I think I'm safe. March 23rd. The knocking isn't random. It's a language. I tried to knock back, and now it's louder, closer. Don't answer. Don't respond. Don't look. I shut the journal abruptly, my pulse quickening. A deep unease settled over me, like the weight of the air had shifted. Outside, the snow fell softly, coating the forest in a deceptive stillness. But Caleb's words lingered, sharp and insistent. It's a language. The day passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound outside the tower felt amplified. The groan of the wind, the creak of the wood, the distant snap of a branch. I busied myself scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, but the binoculars revealed only an endless expanse of white and green. By late afternoon, the radio crackled to life. Ronnie. I grabbed the handset, my voice shaky with relief. His tone was clipped. You've been quiet. I saw smoke yesterday, I said, hesitating. And I found something, a campsite, but no footprints. And this. I unfolded the blood-stained map, as if he could see it through the static. There's a marked spot, deeper in the forest. Ronnie was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Don't go near it. Why not? I demanded. What is it? You're there to watch, not to wander. Stay in the tower, keep your eyes open, and follow the rules. That's how you make it through. The line went dead before I could argue. My frustration boiled over, and I slammed the handset onto the desk. Ronnie's cryptic warnings weren't enough anymore. I needed answers. That night, the knocking returned. It started faintly, a soft rhythm on the stairs. Knock. Knock. Each impact reverberated through the wooden frame of the tower, deliberate and insistent. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness. Nothing. The sound grew louder, more forceful. Knock. Knock. This time, it wasn't just on the stairs, it was on the walls, the windows, the very structure of the cabin. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I backed into the corner, gripping the rifle tightly, and shouted into the empty air. What do you want? The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. I strained to hear anything, any movement, any whisper. But the only sound was my own ragged breathing. And then, faintly, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural hum, like a chant carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the radio. I stared at the handset, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. Static buzzed faintly, interspersed with unintelligible words, a voice, not Ronnie's. Look closer, the distorted voice whispered. I dropped the handset, the sound continuing even as it hit the floor. My eyes darted to the map on the desk, the red X glaring back at me like a challenge. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't sit here and let this thing, whatever it was, toy with me. If the map was a clue, I needed to follow it. Caleb's journal might have been his warning, but it was also my guide, and right now, It was the only thing making any sense. I packed quickly, taking the rifle, the flashlight, and the map. The journal came with me, too, its weight a small comfort. Before I left, I turned on the floodlight, its powerful beam cutting through the morning fog, a beacon in case I needed to find my way back. The forest was colder than usual, the air biting at my face as I trudged through the snow. The map led me southeast, deeper into the trees. The further I went, the quieter it became, the snow muffling my footsteps, and the wind barely rustling the branches above. After an hour, I noticed something strange. The trees around me bore markings, deep gouges carved into the bark, forming crude, jagged shapes. They didn't look like natural damage. They looked deliberate, like someone or something had left them as a trail. The path led me to a clearing. At its center stood a stone circle, the gray rocks weathered and covered in moss. Symbols were etched into their surfaces, similar to the ones on the trees. In the middle of the circle was a pit, its edges uneven and crumbling. The air around it felt charged, like the static before a storm. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the frigid air. The pit seemed impossibly deep, its darkness swallowing the weak light of my flashlight. A faint hum emanated from within, the same sound I'd heard on the radio. As I stared into the void, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the figure, closer now. Its features were still obscured, its body a shadow against the snow, but its eyes, two pinpricks of pale, flickering light, locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, a pressure that pushed against every fiber of my being. The hum from the pit grew louder, resonating in my skull. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as I tried to put distance between myself and the figure. But it didn't follow. It simply stood there, watching. And then, without warning, it raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but at the journal in my pack. The realization hit me like a bolt of ice. This wasn't about the map, or the tower, or even the forest. It was about the journal. I turned and ran, the figure remaining motionless as I fled. The sound of my footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness, my breath hitching with each frantic step. When I finally reached the tower, I climbed the stairs two at a time, slamming the hatch shut behind me. The journal was on the desk, its leather cover worn and unassuming. But it wasn't just Caleb's story anymore, it was mine too. The journal sat on the desk, daring me to open it again. Its pages felt heavier than they had any right to be, weighted with the chaos of Caleb's experiences and my own unraveling. Whatever I had seen in the clearing, it wasn't done with me. The figure's silent gesture toward the journal played in my mind on a loop. The question wasn't what it wanted, it was why it hadn't taken it, or me yet. I flipped through Caleb's entries again, searching for clarity. His words, once chaotic and frenzied, now felt methodical. He had been documenting something larger, piecing together fragments of an incomprehensible puzzle. March 24th. The pit wasn't natural. Something carved it, something old. The symbols, the humming, they pull at you. The map was my warning. If you see the X, don't go. Don't let it know you've seen the X. The pit. The map wasn't just a clue, it was a test. And I had failed. The rest of the day passed in restless silence. I busied myself with routine checks, scanning the forest for smoke, for movement, for anything that might explain what was happening. But the forest offered nothing, just an expanse of white and green, indifferent to my panic. The radio stayed silent, even as I adjusted the frequency and tried to reach Ronnie. His absence was unnerving, leaving me untethered to any sense of normalcy. My fingers hovered over the handset, debating whether to keep trying or to let the silence speak for itself. when the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I secured the tower for the night. The hatch was locked, the floodlight ready. I set the rifle within arm's reach and stared out the window as the darkness crept in. The knocking began at midnight. Knock. Knock. It was rhythmic, deliberate, louder than it had ever been. My pulse quickened as I gripped the rifle and approached the window. The flashlight beam swept over the stairs, but they were empty. Then the scraping began. It started faint, a subtle scratching against the wood, like nails dragged over the surface. But it grew louder, closer, until it sounded as though it was coming from every side of the tower. I backed into the cabin. My breath ragged, the rifle shaking in my hands. The journal sat on the desk, its presence almost mocking. My mind raced with Caleb's warnings: don't look, don't respond, don't break the rules. The scraping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, an oppressive void that pressed against my chest. And then I heard it: footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate steps, each one resonating through the structure. They climbed slowly, methodically, as though savoring the ascent. My grip on the rifle tightened, my knuckles white. The steps stopped just below the hatch. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The hatch creaked slightly under pressure, as though something was testing its weight. I aimed the rifle at the trapdoor, my finger hovering over the trigger. But the hatch didn't open. Instead, a low, guttural hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and into my chest. It was the same sound I had heard at the pit, amplified and suffocating. My vision blurred as the sound seemed to pierce my thoughts, pulling at something deep inside me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I woke up on the floor, the rifle beside me. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt heavy, as though I had been drugged. The journal was open on the desk, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. I didn't remember opening it, but a new entry stared back at me in Caleb's frantic handwriting. March 25th. It will test you. It will take everything you have. But the journal is the key. Keep it close. Keep it safe. Don't let it leave the tower. My stomach churned. The words felt like a curse, binding me to the journal and its secrets. I slammed it shut and shoved it into my pack, determined to put as much distance between myself and the pit as possible. By mid-morning, I had made my decision. I would confront the X on the map. If the journal was the key, then the pit held the lock. Whatever was haunting this place wasn't going to stop until I faced it. The trek was grueling. The snow seemed thicker, the forest darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The journal pulsed in my pack, an almost living thing, its presence a constant weight on my mind. When I reached the clearing, the pit loomed before me, its edges glowing faintly with the strange symbols carved into the stone. The humming was louder now, resonating in my bones. And there it was, the figure. It stood on the far side of the pit, its form clearer than before. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally fluid. Its eyes, those pinpricks of pale light, locked onto mine. And I froze. It raised a hand, pointing at the journal. The hum intensified, the air around me vibrating with its force. My grip on the journal faltered, and it slipped from my hands, tumbling toward the pit. The figure moved then, its body a blur as it lunged for the journal. But I reacted first, grabbing it mid-fall and clutching it to my chest. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting as though in curiosity. The hum faded slightly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I backed away, the journal pressed tightly against me. The figure didn't follow. but its presence lingered, its eyes watching as I stumbled out of the clearing and back into the forest. When I returned to the tower, the sun was setting. My body ached, my mind racing with unanswered questions. The figure's reaction to the journal had been visceral, almost desperate. Whatever it wanted, the journal was the key. But Caleb's warnings echoed in my mind, don't let it leave the tower. That night, as the wind howled and the knocking resumed, I stared at the journal on the desk, its presence heavier than ever. The figure's silent message was clear, it wouldn't stop until I gave it what it wanted. Or until I found out why. The journal stared at me from the desk, its leather cover worn and unassuming, a sharp contrast to the chaos it had unleashed. The figure's reaction at the pit was burned into my mind. Whatever it was, it didn't want me. It wanted this. And yet, Caleb's warning was clear. Don't let it leave the tower. But why? What did the journal contain that was so important? My instincts told me the answers were close, and the journal was the key. Yet the questions gnawed at Meta. Why hadn't Caleb destroyed it? Why had I failed when I tried? And why did the forest feel alive when I carried it with me? I didn't have long to think. As the sun began to set, the wind picked up, and the now familiar knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder this time, resonating through the tower's wooden frame like a battering ram. My body tensed as I grabbed the rifle. I scanned the windows, but the forest remained eerily still. The floodlight was my only weapon against the darkness, but Hank's warning echoed in my minder. Don't mess with the floodlight unless you have to. The knocking stopped. Silence fell, heavier than the wind or the creaking wood. And then, from the radio, came the sound I dreaded most, static. For a moment, I dared to hope it was Ronnie. Ronnie, are you there? I said, my voice trembling. The static crackled, and a voice emerged, not Ronnie's. Bring it back. The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with an inhuman resonance. My hands shook as I backed away from the radio. The journal sat on the desk, almost glowing in the dim light of the cabin. My gut told me it was connected to everything: the pit, the figure, the voices. But connected how? I opened it, flipping through the pages. Caleb's handwriting was frantic, his words barely legible in places. But one entry caught my eye. March 27th. The forest doesn't want us here. The journal isn't just a record, it's a tether to what? I don't know, but I can't let it go. If it leaves, so do I. A tether. The word sent a chill down my spine. Was the journal holding me here or holding something else back? The knocking resumed, faster and more violent, like fists pounding on the walls. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, ascending the stairs. My chest tightened as I aimed the rifle at the hatch, my finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped just outside the trapdoor. Then came the voice again, not from the radio this time, but from directly above me, vibrating through the wood. It's not yours to keep. The trapdoor creaked, the hinges straining under pressure. My breath caught in my throat as I prepared to fire. The journal seemed to pulse on the desk, its presence overwhelming. My instinct screamed at me to throw it out, to rid myself of the cursed thing. But Caleb's words echoed in my mind, if it leaves, so do I. The trapdoor rattled but didn't open. Instead, the voice shifted, softer now, almost coaxing. You don't belong here. Let it go. I stood frozen, torn between two choices. If I kept the journal, the figure would never stop coming. If I let it go, I might survive. But at what cost? The trapdoor fell silent, but the tension in the air remained. My gaze shifted to the journal. I flipped through the pages again, searching for a clue, and found one final entry. March 28th. I made my choice. I threw it into the pit. It didn't save me. It only made it stronger. Eddie had tried to escape by giving it what it wanted, and he had failed. I stepped away from the desk, my thoughts racing. If the journal was a tether, then destroying it wasn't enough. It needed to be severed. But how? The wind howled outside, rattling the tower. The floodlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to move, stretching toward the cabin. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal, its weight somehow heavier than before. Then it hit me. The pit. The journal had come from there, or at least, it was tied to it. If I could destroy it, maybe I could return it to where it belonged. But doing so would mean venturing into the clearing again, facing whatever waited there. The thought sent a wave of fear through me, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The trek to the pit was agonizing. The snow seemed thicker, the forest darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The journal pulsed in my pack, an almost living thing, its presence a constant weight on my mind. When I reached the clearing, the pit loomed before me, its edges glowing faintly with the strange symbols carved into the stone. The humming was louder now, resonating in my bones. And there it was, the figure. It stood on the far side of the pit, its pale eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I stepped closer to the pit, the journal in my hands. The humming intensified, the air vibrating with energy. The figure tilted its head, watching as I approached. "Return it." The voice was a whisper, yet it filled the clearing. I hesitated. Eddie's warning played in my mind. It didn't save me. It only made it stronger. But if keeping the journal meant staying trapped in this nightmare, then what choice did I have? I took another step toward the pit, the journal trembling in my hands. The figure remained still, its gaze unblinking. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I hurled the journal into the darkness. The moment the journal vanished into the pit, the humming stopped. The forest fell silent. The air stilled. The figure tilted its head again, then began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The pit began to glow, a deep, pulsing red light emanating from its depths. The ground shook beneath my feet, and a sound unlike anything I had ever heard erupted from the void, a scream, guttural and primal, filled with rage and triumph. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their trunks groaning as if alive. The symbols on the stones pulsed, their glow intensifying. The pit wasn't closing, it was opening. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The trees moved, their branches clawing at me, the snow shifting under my feet. The scream followed me, growing louder, more deafening with each step. When I reached the tower, I slammed the hatch shut and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The radio crackled to life, and Ronnie's voice came through, urgent and panicked. "What did you do?" I threw it in," I stammered. A long pause, then in a voice filled with dread, Ronnie said, "You've made it worse." The days that followed were a blur. The forest never went silent again. The knocking stopped, but the hum persisted, faint yet constant, a reminder of the choice I had made. When the snowmobile arrived to pick me up, Hank didn't say a word. He glanced at the tower, then at me, his expression grim. I climbed into the sled without looking back. As we sped away, I felt a strange weight in my bag. My heart sank as I opened it and found the journal, its leather cover pristine, its pages blank. The pit had returned it, and now it was mine.